Hello, everyone, and welcome to Teachly University. And in this lecture today, we're going to be discussing inflation. As you can see, it's a little bit of a different layout, but I kind of wanted to show this to you in real time to see how this is impacting the markets and what factors influence inflation and what could potentially happen moving forward. So you can see by this headline here, the U.S. inflation quickens to 40-year high, pressuring Fed and Biden. So inflation, the best way to describe it is a decline in purchasing power of the dollar due to increased demand and increased money in circulation and not enough supply in goods and services to satisfy that demand and money in circulation. Thus, we see an increase in prices and a decline in the purchasing power of the dollar. And this is becoming a huge problem. In fact, inflation has reached 40-year highs where now the average is about 8.6%, which is the highest we've seen it since about 1980 or 1982, the early 1980s, around that era. So we could see that. In any case, this is truly unprecedented, and this is putting a tremendous amount of political pressure on the White House as well as the Federal Reserve, who is being run currently by Jay Powell, and who, as of yesterday, the Federal Reserve decided to raise interest rates by about 75 basis points, which is the highest rate hike in over 40 years, or 30 years for that matter. So we could see that inflation is a huge problem because out of fears of a recession and how inflation can impact the consumers and the economy as a whole. So, how can we measure inflation? Well, one way to do that is through what's called the Consumer Price Index. And the CPI is basically the average price of a basket of goods and services such as food, energy, apparel, education, commodities, vehicles, etc. And we can see on this chart that when you account for all of these items, on average, it's gone up about 8.6%. We've seen on average price increase for these basket of products and services. Most notably, though, when you just take into account energy prices have skyrocketed to levels really never seen before. In fact, the average price of gas now is about $5 a gallon. And most notably, I find interesting is really when you go back to 2020. We all remember where we were back then. I think we're trying to forget with the COVID shutdowns and really how there was really not much demand for travel, for driving, because everyone was basically locked up in their homes. Businesses were shut down. So there was very little demand, all the supply of oil. Thus, oil prices cratered. And of course, then over time, well, we saw home gas prices recover. And then as a result, though, as the world has reopened now, emerging from the COVID pandemic, we've seen gas prices explode. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case, from increased demand to energy policy here at home to the war in Ukraine, as well as other factors that are really contributing to this increase in prices and this inflation that we're experiencing. So then, what are the driving factors behind inflation? And I want to use this little chart here from Investopedia. It's a neat little graphic. And I love this website. I recommend you use it. It's a great way to kind of do research on finances or any terms or topics related to business that maybe you're unfamiliar with. So there's several factors that influence inflation. One is the built-in, which is when prices rise, wages rise too in order to maintain living costs. So when prices rise to compensate, companies will raise their wages as well, especially if there's a labor shortage or unemployment rates are low. Then companies are willing to raise their wages in order to entice employees to work for them. Thus, it raises wages and also the cost of living as well as prices go up. Also, there's cost and push when production costs increase prices. So what that means is that companies will use raw materials and labor to produce products that they sell to consumers in the open market. So if, for example, if the cost of raw materials go up to produce those products, or if there's not enough labor to go around, then they have to raise their prices or their salaries to entice employees to work for them. That can all increase the manufacturing cost of producing that product. Thus, they have to pass on those costs to consumers, which can raise prices as well. And then there's demand pull, is that when demand for goods and services exceeds production capacity. So quite simply, when we see increased demand and not enough supply to compensate or satisfy that demand, and we see this when home prices have exploded in the past few years because there was all this demand for homes and not enough supply to compensate or satisfy that demand. And part of what fueled this housing boom is really because of low interest rates set by the Fed, and more specifically, the low interest rate you can get on a mortgage, where Not too long ago, you were able to get a conventional rate mortgage for as little as 2% interest on that loan. Of course, those days are over. Right now, interest rates are at about 6% or are likely to go higher. So then, with inflation really becoming a huge problem and seeing these factors that are influencing inflation, what then can be done? Well, going back to Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve, how the Federal Reserve operates is that basically they create, at least, that's their creed anyway, that their role, their responsibility is to create economic stability, high employment by controlling interest rates or controlling the cost of borrowing. So, for example, for a long time, interest rates were at very low levels, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. And the purpose of this was to keep borrowing cheap so that it can stimulate the economy. People can have more access to capital, borrow so they can expand their businesses, so they can purchase more items, and so on and so forth. And really, that is what, at least according to the Fed, their role was in trying to keep the economy afloat right after the 2008 financial crisis. And since then, interest rates really have been kept low for quite a long time. And the Fed keeps rates low in order to stimulate the economy and keep it growing. But what happens is that when the economy grows too fast, then we can see inflation where there's so much money in circulation, so much demand, and not enough supply to meet that demand. Then the Fed has to tamper down demand by increasing the cost of borrowing. So that means that right now, as the Fed raises rates, that means it's much more expensive to acquire a mortgage or car loan. The rates are going to go up on your credit cards. The rates on student loans will go up as well. So you can see this is also that people can spend less money, create less demand, thus forcing prices to go down. So you can see then this is how the Fed operates. And it may be overly simplistic, but really this is how the Fed is able to manage these boom and bust cycles by manipulating interest rates. Now, critics of the Fed argue that the Federal Reserve really creates these boom and bust cycles and that interest rates and prices should be set by supply and demand, whereas supporters of the Fed say, well, if you leave interest rates to market forces alone, then that can create more volatility, and you will need the Federal Reserve as kind of a guide to help create soft landings in the event that there is an economic crisis or that we see high inflation like we're seeing now. And that's what the Federal Reserve is hoping for, that they can get a soft landing by raising interest rates. It really just means that they can slow down the economy to the point where they can drive down prices while not causing a recession. But there's a lot of talk right now, a lot of fear about a recession occurring, and we can see this now if you just look up here by the latest reaction by the stock market. The market has really been tanking out of fears that there's going to be a recession. And we can see how emotion really plays a role in how markets operate and how really what we're seeing right now with inflation and these emotions can become a self-fulfilling prophecy as far as what can happen down the road with the economy and with inflation. So it's something to watch and to keep an eye on. But the Federal Reserve is pretty persistent when it comes to dealing with inflation, at least according to Powell's comments, that they are going to meet this head on and raise interest rates until they control inflation.